Our scripture reading this morning is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 21, verses 1 to 13. When they had come near Jerusalem and had reached Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, just say, 'The Lord needs them,' and he will send them immediately." This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet, saying, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowd then went ahead of him, and that followed were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven." When he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, asking, "Who is this?" The crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." Then Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who were selling and buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables, the money changers, and the seats of those who sold doves. He said to them, "It is written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer,' but you are making it a den of robbers."
Thank you, Marcel. The parade matters. The parade matters. But the slog matters more. By the time the Passover festival is right around the corner, Jesus' Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, now known as X accounts, have blown up, as they say. And now, the man himself is coming into Jerusalem for Passover. So when the word gets out about what day and time Jesus is expected to make his way into Jerusalem from the nearby town of Bethphage, well, people line the road leading into the city. They camp out ahead of time to get a prime spot at the parade, hoping to get a glimpse of Jesus as he passes by, or maybe even a wave, or possibly a touch of his hand. It's like Taylor Swift and Beyonce are coming into town all at once. Because for those people, the people who joined the parade that day, Jesus was, long before Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice created their famous musical, he was Jesus Christ Superstar. Some of the parade goers, some of his fans, lay their cloaks in the road that Jesus will be traveling. No small sacrifice on their part, because for many of them, that may have been the only cloak they owned. Others cut down tree branches and lay those in the road. Both signs, symbols of honor in that time and place. But signs of honor are usually reserved for military heroes, political leaders, kings, emperors, not some wandering rabbi from the village of Nazareth in the region of Galilee. But for many of the parade goers, Jesus is one or more or maybe all of those things. Hero, leader, and king, military hero, political leader, and king, all rolled into one. Because that was what encompassed the understanding in that time of place and of who and what the long-awaited, long-expected Messiah would be. The one, the military leader, political leader, and king who would come to free the people from everything that held them captive. And especially in that time, free them from the hated Romans who had conquered their land and oppressed their people economically. Whatever it took. But as Jesus starts to come into view of the parade goers, well, remember how a few weeks ago I mentioned that this is the 50th anniversary of the iconic sketch comedy show Saturday Night Live? Well, as Jesus starts to come into view of the parade goers, things start to turn into a Saturday Night Live type sketch. In fact, it reminds me a little bit of one of the early classic sketches from that show. One where frequent guest host Steve Martin comes out onto a stage that is set up as an old gas station. Martin just stands there for a few minutes, looking out into the distance, before finally saying with a southern accent for some reason, "What the heck is that?" And then for the next minute or so, he just says the same thing over and over, but at different time intervals and with different inflections and different volumes. He also doesn't say heck, he says the other word, but it is Sunday, we're here in church, I'll go with heck. He just keeps looking out, going, "What the heck is that?" And then, "What the heck is that? What the heck is that?" Over and over, before finally, cast member Bill Murray shows up. And Bill Murray looks out for a while and he goes, "What the heck is that?" And then they go back and forth doing the same thing for about another minute before they both start to walk off stage. And then Martin creeps back in and goes, "What the heck was that?" As Jesus comes into view of the parade goers, they look out into the distance and go, "What the heck is that? Is that Jesus riding on two donkeys?" Well, yes and no. The writer of Matthew's gospel tells us that Jesus comes into Jerusalem riding on a donkey and a colt, the foal of a donkey, which you got to admit brings up some pretty comical imagery. Jesus would have needed some Simone Biles level flexibility to pull that one off. But Matthew has a purpose in all of that. See, throughout Matthew's gospel, he goes out of his way, sometimes overboard, to connect Jesus to the Hebrew Scriptures. To connect Jesus to the Hebrew Scriptures, to the Jewish tradition, in order to make and enhance the case that he is making for Jesus being that long-awaited, long-expected Messiah to his early Christian community, which is made up of Jewish Christians, that phrase we've used to describe members of the early Christian community who had found in Jesus the Messiah but still believed they were fully faithful Jews, saw themselves that way. His community made up of Jewish Christians and Greek-speaking Jews from other parts of the Roman Empire, a community that lived in and around the ancient city of Antioch about 55 years after Jesus' death. Matthew, throughout the gospel, goes out of his way to connect Jesus to the Hebrew Scriptures and tradition. Here, he is quoting from the prophet Zechariah. And in the 9th chapter of the book of the prophet Zechariah, Zechariah describes the one who is coming, presumed to be the Messiah, the one who is coming from God, who will come riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. But Zechariah writes it on a donkey, comma, on a colt, semicolon, the foal of a donkey. For Zechariah, it's one donkey. Okay? He is using a not uncommon literary device in that time, in the ancient world, known as synonymous parallelism, okay? Which is essentially means to say the same thing in two different ways in the same sentence or in the same verse. Matthew, because he is so intent on connecting Jesus to the Hebrew Scriptures and sometimes going overboard to do it, writes that Jesus rides in on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a donkey. It reminds me of one of my favorite T-shirts of all time. The first line says, "Let's eat, comma, Grandma." The second line says, "Let's eat, Grandma." No comma. On the back, the shirt says, "Punctuation matters." But again, Matthew either accidentally does that or does it on purpose in order to serve his purposes. Just like Jesus rides into Jerusalem on that donkey, that one donkey, to serve his purposes. Because see, Jesus knows, all those parade goers know that in their time and place, and really for the most part today, donkeys were considered to be service animals, beasts of burden. And military heroes, political leaders, kings and emperors did not ride on donkeys. They rode on stallions, on war horses. Jesus rides into Jerusalem on that donkey, that one donkey, to make a statement to those attending the parade that he has no intention of being that kind of hero, that kind of leader, that kind of king. That he has no intention of being the kind of hero, leader, and king who exercises power like the Romans do and so many others throughout history have. Through the tip of a spear or a sword, through domination, through exploitation, through violence, coercion, and oppression. Instead, Jesus makes a statement by riding in on that donkey that he will be the kind of hero and leader and king whose power comes in and through God's ways of mercy and forgiveness and compassion and justice and kindness and all the rest. Riding on that donkey, that one donkey, is Jesus' way of making that statement. And maybe another one. Because as Jesus and all those parade goers know, as service animals, as beasts of burden, donkeys need to be persistent. They got to have stamina. They got to be able to stick with the task they are called to. When conditions and circumstances change, become more difficult, they got to stay with it. When they get weary, when they get afraid, when there is struggle involved. Donkeys have to be able to keep plugging and plodding. They need to be able to keep slogging. Jesus knows that he and that donkey are going to need to keep slogging. They're going to keep slogging on because as the days go by, things are going to be getting a little bit more difficult, a little bit harder. There's going to be struggling and suffering likely involved. Especially after he makes one last statement. As Marcel read for us in that passage from Matthew's Gospel, Jesus and that donkey slog on all the way into Jerusalem until Jesus enters the outer courtyard of the temple, the place where during Passover merchants would sell animals and birds that were necessary for the required Passover temple sacrifice. Also in the temple courtyard, there would be money changers set up for the purpose of exchanging foreign out-of-town currency for the required temple coinage during Passover. As Matthew tells us, Jesus goes into the outer courtyard, drives out the merchants selling the animals and the birds, turns over the tables of the currency exchangers. The traditional understanding of that is that Jesus is upset with, he is making a statement of condemnation against the economic practices that are going on at that time. That those merchants are selling those animals and birds far beyond the normal price because they have a captive audience, all those Jews who are coming from all over the known world. And those currency exchangers are, again, doing the same thing, jacking up their rates because they have a captive audience. And yes, Jesus is clearly concerned with economic exploitation, with economic justice in the Gospels. But other scholars focus on the phrase den of robbers or den of thieves, depending upon the translation. And while some see in that phrase validation for their idea of why Jesus is upset and does what he does in the temple, other scholars look at that phrase and see in it one also from the Hebrew Scriptures. A den of thieves, a den of robbers in the Hebrew Scriptures refers to a place where robbers and thieves would go to hide out as a safe place, as a refuge. And so those scholars look at that, Jesus' statement that they have turned the temple into a den of thieves or a den of robbers, as reflecting instead the idea that the people, and especially their leaders, are using the temple as a hideout, as a safe place, that what they are doing is they are hiding out in the temple, in that they are relying on, they are emphasizing the rituals and the sacrifices of their tradition, while ignoring, turning their back on living outside of the temple as God calls them to do. Living out God's ways of justice and mercy. What Jesus would refer to earlier in Matthew's gospel as the weightier matters. Okay? Hiding behind ritual and structure, rather than living out the ways God calls them to. Either way, Jesus knows that none of this, not his little stunt riding in on that one donkey, or what he has done in the temple, is going to win him any fans. It will make the religious and Roman authorities suspicious. And it will turn off some of those fans who line the parade route. But at the same time, Jesus knows that you either stay true to the ways that God calls you to live, the mission that God has given you, or you don't. Especially when things get hard, when there is more struggle involved, especially when others fall away, or at least you do the best you can. Because Jesus knows that others will fall away. And they do. Before long, Jesus and that donkey are left to slog on pretty much all alone. All of them. Almost everyone else gone. Where'd they go? Where'd they go? Why did they fall away? Well, they probably fell away for the same reasons that we humans always fall away. Always fall away at times. I imagine some of them fell away because they were afraid. They were afraid that if they slogged on with Jesus, they would be subject to the same kinds of struggle and suffering that they understood he likely would, as the religious and Roman authorities became more and more suspicious, more and more concerned with him. Guessing others fell away because they didn't understand, or maybe didn't like what they understood, that he wasn't going to be the kind of hero and leader and king that they were looking for, that they were hoping for, that they insisted on. Still others, I think, probably fell away because they didn't like the demands. The demands were just too much for them. To stay compassionate, to give justice, kindness, mercy under difficult circumstances, and even to people you weren't really thrilled with, to love your enemies? What? No, thank you. And then others, well, I wonder if others didn't fall away because they just got tired. Because they just got tired. Because they just got tired of trying to keep slogging on day after day, time after time. Because they succumbed to what Deborah Edwards, professor at Cardiff University in Wales, refers to as moral fatigue. Edwards says that over time, when we are exposed to, are a part of, are experiencing situations, contexts, circumstances that require constant moral vigilance, we can become over time, physically, emotionally, mentally, socially, and spiritually exhausted. Exhausted. Finding it harder and harder to do what is right in the moment. Finding it harder and harder to slog on when it comes to living out God's ways. Especially, she says, in times of turmoil. The writer of Matthew's gospel tells us that when Jesus enters Jerusalem, the city is in turmoil. But he doesn't really explain that. But there are thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people from all over the known world, from all different kinds of cultures, speaking different kinds of languages, coming together in the city and trying to be unified, trying to live with each other and carry out the Passover festival in a unified way, at the same time trying to do that under the constant watch of Rome's increased military presence. Something that was the norm at that time of year. So maybe that's the turmoil. The city was in turmoil. Just like, I don't think it's a stretch to say the city is in turmoil now. The city, the society, the culture, the nation, the world is in turmoil now. And it always is, really, to some degree, but certainly seems to be right now. And I don't know about you, but there are times right now that I am exhausted. I am exhausted with trying to keep slogging on, trying to stay faithful to God and God's ways as embodied in Jesus moment by moment, day by day. Times when I wouldn't mind going wherever the heck it was that all those parade goers went. Maybe you feel that way too. So what do? How do we keep slogging on, especially in a time of turmoil when it is needed the most? How do we keep slogging on? Well, there's no one big magic answer. There never is. But maybe, I think, there's a really good example here in this story. The example that Jesus and that donkey give us. Jesus and that donkey keep slogging on together. They do it together. They continue, they support each other. They encourage each other. The donkey carries Jesus, Jesus cares for the donkey. They do it together. And they also slog on together, one slow, plodding step at a time. One slow, slogging, plodding step at a time. They do what the renowned pioneering psychoanalyst Carl Jung said. They commit to just doing the next right thing. Just one. Just the next right thing, however small that might be. That's the way. That's the way to keep slogging on. That is the way of Lent. That is the way of Holy Week. And that is the way that saves. The parade goers shout out, Hosanna! Hosanna, as Jesus goes by them. Hosanna, a Hebrew word, which means either save us or God saves. And sometimes in the Bible, salvation, it's where the word salvation comes from. Sometimes in the Bible, salvation comes in a single spectacular moment. Sometimes it comes in a single act of heroism. Sometimes it comes in a single amazing spiritual insight. Sometimes it comes through a single person. Sometimes it comes through a single parade. But far more often than that, the biblical literature is very, very clear. Salvation comes to us far more often than not. One plugging, plodding, slogging step at a time. It comes to us through slogging on. Slogging on like that donkey and Jesus, slogging on with Jesus and the God that he embodies. Because while the parade matters, the slogging matters more. Way more. Amen.